One of the most remarkable patterns we see in human behavior is that all of us, whether we have a religious faith or not, behave in a way that is contrary to our core systems of morality. Within Christianity, we say we should love our neighbors, and yet we hate them. We believe it's wrong to pursue materialism, and we design our lives around acquiring more stuff. We decry the objectification of other humans, and then we lust and oogle after other beings. We call this tendency to do what we know we shouldn't our sinful nature. Now, at Disciple Science, we're especially interested in how all Christians agree that God assigned humanity dominion, or what we call stewardship, a responsibility to look after nature, and yet we utterly fail to do so. And that's where this book comes in, The Gospel of Climate Skepticism by Globus Veldman. It's an account of why Christians, despite our agreement of the biblical call to care, often do just the opposite. I asked Robin, who is an assistant professor of religious studies at Texas A&M, if she would be willing to come on and share with you some of what she discovered in her work, and she was gracious enough to do so. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Dr. Robin Globus Veldman. Well, welcome, Robin Globus Veldman, to the Disciple Science podcast. It's an honor to have you here today to talk about the work that you've done exploring some of the patterns behind Christians and how we think about the topic of climate change, and will help us understand why this issue has been a source of tension and controversy, and hopefully help us figure out a pathway to move out of that historic tension. So thanks for joining us today. It's great to have you with us.
It's my pleasure. Yeah, it's harder to think of pathways out than it is to really map out the problem. But
it is, for sure. Well, we're having you on because you recently wrote a great book called The Gospel of Climate Skepticism. I'm going to just hold my copy up here, which I had the opportunity to read over the past few months, and found it just deeply insightful, and that you dig deeper into some historic kind of just assumptions that all of this is driven by politics, or it's driven by theology, and the work that you did will give us some great context into what's behind those historic ideas, and maybe some very much novel ideas. Now, you're listed as a professor of religious studies. Is that right? What can you tell us a little bit about what got you interested in this field of study?
yeah, it was sort of a long and winding path, but at some point, I majored in environmental studies in college. I was super passionate about that, and kind of meandered a bit after college trying to figure out what I wanted to do. But at some point, I just started noticing how I was living in New Mexico at the time, and just how people were kind of combining spirituality with environmental concern. And I just found it really intriguing, but I am more of an observer just by nature. And I think I wanted to understand it better, rather than to kind of, get sucked in and start necessarily practicing myself. And then I learned that there was a program that focuses on the study of religion and nature that was just starting up at that point at the University of Florida. And so it just seemed like a really good fit. And I had no idea what I was getting into. The academic study of religion is very different from the practice of religion.
Sure.
And I didn't fully understand that when I started. When I started my program, like I sort of got it, but I didn't really get it. So yeah, I went into it not fully knowing what I was getting into.
Great. And so you focus on Christianity and their views of the environment and nature in general, right? And can you, I don't know, this is a really big topic, but can you give us sort of a broad background? What are the general trends that we see in how different people groups, religious groups, racial groups, socioeconomic groups respond to this big issue of climate change?
Yes. If we're thinking about just in the US context, one of the really interesting things is that religion does matter quite a bit. It's the most influential factor. Like if you look at like correlates of climate skepticism or climate acceptance, politics is the most influential. So that one kind of overwhelms most of the other factors.
Mm.
But what I argue is that, particularly when it comes to politics, because politics and religion are so conflated in the United States currently,
Yep.
especially for conservative Christians to some degree, it's to say that it's just politics is really ignoring a lot of what's going on, because there's a lot of actual religious engagement with climate change. But the big ones in terms of, what seems to shape how Americans in particular think about climate change is politics, and then gender. For some reason, women are less likely to be skeptical than men, or they're more likely to be concerned. They're apparent, women in general are more risk averse than men.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. There's a lot of different theories, but it's one of the findings. We don't exactly know why. And then religiosity is the third one. And then there's some stuff related to like risk perceptions and whether you've recently been through a heat wave that has like a short-term effect. But really, politics, religion, and gender are the top three factors influencing how people think about climate change.
Okay. So this is really interesting right from the start, right? As we look at religion and politics, especially, we would think gender would be fairly equal there, at least as far as you've got males and females in different political parties and males and females in different religions. But within highly religious groups, you've got really different disparities within, sort of Black Christian communities and Hispanic Christian communities and white Christian communities. Do we see this political association is playing out in the same way across those different racial groups as well?
Oh, that's actually a really good question. And I haven't seen that much research on like conservative, like Orthodox Jews, for example. They're very religiously conservative, but I don't know how that plays out, if at all, with climate change. So I can't say generally, and I'm not sure anybody has really looked into that. There's been, of the research that's been done on religion, actually evangelicals have received quite a bit of attention because of their political influence. And within that, I did some research recently and found out that when you break evangelicals down by their ethnicity or racial background, there is quite a gap between white evangelicals and evangelicals of color. But there's a couple things going on, like evangelicals of color also tend to be younger, and younger people are, younger evangelicals are a bit more open to climate change. So we're kind of open to accepting, consensus science. So it's not fully clear what exactly is driving that. So that's something that I'm hoping that we'll get to find out.
Yeah. And can you elaborate on what's driving the political association? I think we've even talked about this a little bit before on this podcast, but there's the inclination towards small government, and maybe the inclination toward free market solutions to problems. Is it that simple? What else is behind the conservative desire? Maybe desire is the wrong word, but the conservative tendency to be more skeptical of climate change, or I should say human-caused climate change.
Yeah. It gets to be a mouthful, doesn't it? I think there's two things going on. There's a lot in the book. I tried to put together sort of a panoramic picture that was both historical and looking at the present moment. And that is really a challenge to get across succinctly. And I'm not sure, I did it like the best way possible or anything, but one of the things that we have to keep in mind, I think, is the history of public religion, but especially political engagement on the part of evangelicals goes back to the late 1970s. So we have, 80s, 90s, and then, so it's been like 40, 50 years of this engagement. And during this time, evangelicals, but basically white evangelicals, sort of got integrated more closely. They became the base of the Republican Party. And that's not like me as like a partisan person saying that. Like everybody knows that's the case. Like, I know. Of course, it's not controversial. I'm not saying it should be that way or it shouldn't be that way. It's just the way it is.
It's just the way it is, right?
Yeah. And because of that, what's really fascinating is that, Americans in general have started to associate their identity with their political identity. It's become a really strong form of identity, not only for Republicans, but also for Democrats. But looking at the Republican side, there's been a lot of, decades of integration where you have all of these, kind of pro-business, like Republican side, or, policy ideas that have started to, there's been decades of synergy between, the religious side and the political side there. So, and I think you can't ignore that when looking at climate change, which first came on the public radar in basically in 1988. There was like a Senate testimony about it, but really nothing much happened for, on and on and on. Into the, the 90s and early 2000s, not much was happening. Or at least no like major international agreements. Obviously, people were trying to make stuff happen through the governmental panel on climate change and, all of the like UN sort of affiliated organizations. But that history, I think, is really critical because it created this time for organizations like the Acton Institute, which is big on like free market economics with kind of blending in faith, to be able to create an organization like the Cornwall Alliance, which the Cornwall Alliance is the main climate skeptic organization within evangelicalism. So it would, if you ignore history, then you don't see the decades and, the year after year of work kind of integrating this small government vision with that, was kind of both a political idea and favorable to many evangelicals. And putting those two together worked really well also for people who are opposed to climate action, because it being a big, enormous problem, I'm not a policy expert,
but yeah, it seems like we default to government solutions when we talk about climate issues most often. So you can, yeah, it makes sense.
It's hard to see it being fully addressed on an individual level just because there's so many issues of scale. And so, so that basically put it in the crosshairs of people who had become really central to the policy ideas of the Republican Party.
And did you choose to study white evangelicals because they are the most skeptical group, or is there what drove you into this specific project that you took on?
Oh yeah, well, it ended up there. I mean, I thought I was going to study religion, and I ended up so much more in like politics than I ever thought was going to be the case. Yeah, maybe I should have gotten a PhD in political science, like given where I ended up. But no, I mean, I went out to study the impact of end time beliefs, and if you've read the book, they're in the mid 2000s, like 2005, 2006, there was a bunch of attention to this idea that the Bush administration's climate policy was, they're kind of like foot dragging and like questioning, the Kyoto Protocol. And Bill Moyers, the journalist, had this famous speech, saying that, the reason why this is happening is because of all of these Christians who believe in rapture. They don't care if the world burns. In fact, they're looking forward to it, and it was such an outrageous claim. And it just was like it was like the early days kind of things going viral, and it just kept circulating. And I looked at it and I was like, well, it's not just Bill Moyers, it's also Al Gore and so many other people, some who are evangelicals themselves, who have said that this is like the key factor, the reason why evangelicals are not, on board with this issue. And it just kind of, I don't know how it is for other researchers, but it just like put a hook in me, and I was like, I want to understand this better.
Is this really what's driving this?
Yeah, like it just seemed like such a caricature, and it was also so just salacious. There's just something about that idea where you're like, and I tried to convey that in the book, and I never feel like I quite could put my finger on the way from the environmentalist side, which since I was an environmental studies major, I feel like I'm, kind of an environmentalist.
Yeah.
That there's like almost a joy in being able to like blame, like that's who it is, and like they're just crazy, and they're like, there's something like, I think in part it's because climate action is so complicated. Maybe you just want to be able to say there's some specific group that's responsible, but there was just something weird about the feeling that whole conversation had that really stuck me in and made me want to understand it better.
That's great. I mean, it's really compelling. Good for you for wanting to dig a little deeper. I think even I, prior to really studying this in detail myself, was compelled by, like, is that really what's driving this? Is that really what we believe? I mean, as a young Christian, before studying it in greater depth, trying to figure out if this is what I'm supposed to believe, and kind of coming to the conclusion that it's not. But I was fascinated by why so many people do. But so elaborate then on how you did your work. Where did you go? How did you find people to talk to? And I'm really interested to hear about the conversations that you had, as we tease apart what you found. So
Yeah. Well, part of my training in my PhD program was there's been a lot of research on world religions in general and how they shape environmental attitudes. It's something that most people never think about. It's like not on their radar at all, but there's this little cohort of scholars who are thinking about it. What does, being a Buddhist, like, all their values of interconnection and whatever, does that lead to more environmental behavior? Does it not? So that was how I was trained, looking at all these different religious traditions and how they shaped environmental attitudes. And one of the things that came out of that whole study was that people were looking too much at scripture and not looking at practice, like how people actually live out their traditions. And so I, from the very beginning, was like, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to like move past this analysis of just a scripture-based approach, or like looking at how people make sense of sacred texts, and go and talk to people in the field. And so I was based at the University of Florida, which is like North Florida, and Georgia was a pretty nearby location that wasn't within like the university bubble, which has its own kind of distorting effect, right? Like university towns are just not like your average town.
They're not normal towns, right? Yeah.
No. And so yeah, that's kind of how I ended up in Georgia. And one of the things that the first challenge I had when I got out into the field was identifying evangelical churches, because I thought I knew what an evangelical was. And then I was like, wait, how do I find them? Like, how do I know which church there's so many Christian churches, which ones are evangelical and which ones are not? And so I remember sending an email to one of my committee members being like, okay, wait, how do I actually like figure out which ones are evangelical? Which is now is like, when I teach my classes, we spend time on like, okay, this is how the National Association of Evangelicals defines it. This is how, some scholars define it. And there's like debate, it's debated and everything. But anyway, so yeah, I eventually, I pulled out the phone book. I created this list of, I tried to get churches that were in, like, I was in a smaller town, but also ones that were rural and some that were in a larger city that were nearby to, so it's not just like all the like rural churches or something. And then I just started calling up pastors and saying I, had a research project, and I kind of framed it as I'm really interested in hearing about your church's views or your views on social issues. And I didn't say like, hey, I'm a grad student, I'd like to talk about climate change, right? Like, it just seemed like that wasn't the right way to start the conversation. So we always talked about a bunch of other things before talking about climate change. But that was kind of like how I opened the door to different conversations.
Were they all pretty open and happy to have you come in and have these conversations, or did you ever get anybody that was resistant to it?
Oh yeah, no, it's not like everybody said yes.
Okay.
And I also, I'm clearly an outsider. You can hear it in my accent, when you go to Georgia, I don't have a Georgia accent. So, and
or a Texan
I don't know.
accent,
Well, yeah, I may have a California accent. I don't know. But yeah, no, I just clearly was an outsider. And even just in the fact that they didn't know me, because some of the churches were in small towns, so they would know of somebody. And so, yeah, no, I had people who were like, no, we're not interested. But a fair number were happy to talk to me, and some I talked to the pastor, but they were not that comfortable having me do a focus group there. Like, I'm guessing in some cases, just because like one pastor in particular, I remember he had just started, and I think he was like, I don't want to, give this impression this is what I'm all about or something. So yeah, it definitely wasn't everybody, and you have to get used to being almost like a salesman in the sense that someone might slam the door in your face. But yeah, it's in the end, I mean, people I talked to were all incredibly generous with their time. So that
great.
that was nice.
Were you targeting white evangelical churches, or did you also talk to? I would think in Georgia, I mean, and this is maybe a trope, but I've always been given the impression, I don't remember who we attribute for the quote, but that Sunday morning at 11 a.m. is the most segregated time of a given week, and that most churches tend to be kind of dominated by white communities or Black communities. Did you talk to folks from both Black and white churches, or were you targeting more white evangelicals?
Yeah, no, I really wish I had. I talked to mostly white churches.
Okay.
So I went with, and over the years, I've had plenty of time to kick myself for that decision. But at the time, I was kind of like, well, I know what people expect relative to white evangelicals. So I can position my research relative to what, has already been found
Yeah.
versus Black evangelicals. I didn't even really think of those terms at the time, but like, there was no research. So stupid,
Yeah.
right? Like I should have
Right.
just gone out and been like, I'd love to talk to you, but I didn't. And some of the Pentecostal churches I visited, Pentecostals are, I know that, there's different ways of grouping evangelicals, but political scientists and scholars of religion often tend to group evangelicals, charismatics, and Pentecostals under the evangelical category, and fundamentalists as well. So those are the four groups that are usually considered evangelical, at least by scholars. So the Pentecostal churches were more multiracial, and I did visit a Seventh-day Adventist church, which is not evangelical, but it is Protestant, and really end time teachings are important for them, and they were fairly multiracial as well.
Okay.
But I think what you're saying is true. I remember driving through the countryside and being like, oh wow, there's a church that's completely full, and it was all African Americans, and like just driving past on my way to these other churches. And I'm not from the South, so I wasn't fully attuned to those dynamics. And yeah, I'm sure everybody has like second guesses themselves, but I do wish that I had talked to people. I mean, it was actually hard enough to get into white evangelical churches.
I'm sure. Yeah.
So I don't know how much luck I would have had, but I wish I had tried.
Yeah. Well, we can, I mean, but that's a topic for maybe later on. As I read this, that was my biggest questions. I would love for you or someone to replicate this study with Black evangelicals. I think from the past couple of elections, we've learned so much that our religion does influence our identity and our politics, but the Black Christian church seems to be the most identity defying, or one of the most, and that they tend not to be politically conservative, and yet tend to be very, committed to their Christian beliefs. And so how that influences their views on the environment, which sort of spans that, would be a real interesting topic for future study.
Yeah, what's crazy is that people don't ever, like, part of the reason no studies have been done is the way that coding schemes work for these large surveys that people use to test their hypotheses don't separate Black evangelicals. Like, they don't have a way of doing it, and so they're lumped together with Black Protestants, or sometimes I think they might just be kind of not included in the analysis. So it's really I have the same questions as you.
Interesting. Yep.
Anyone who's listening to this, do
that
project.
There we go. Next, somebody's dissertation for the future. Okay, so it sounds like you were focused especially on end times belief and theology, and it was clear that you explored that topic. So can you share with us what did you learn? Was that driving people to be apathetic about environmental concern, or was it more complex?
Yeah, well, it was the latter for sure. It was definitely more complex, as things always are when you go out and talk to people. It took me a long time to be able to come up with any sort of summary statements. When I talked to people, I definitely ran into people, and I mentioned it in the book, like one woman at a Pentecostal church, I just was saying, yeah, I'm doing this research on the environment. And, she immediately chimed in with like, yeah, the end times are coming, and like environmental degradation is a sign. I don't remember the exact words she used, but yeah, like, it was just like that belief definitely exists. But what I ended up deciding, and so I did focus groups, and they were all located in Georgia. So it's not like a nationally representative sample, but it's representative of different at least different sized churches and different denominations, so not just all one denomination. I always ran into, let me put it differently. I didn't always, like, it was common to meet at least one, if not a couple people at a particular focus group who were really excited about the end times. Like, they found meaning in it. They thinking about the idea of the rapture and the world, the world to come, like that was exciting to them. And I recognize that because before I started my PhD, I hung out with a lot of environmental apocalyptics, and I know that they exist and they're excited about, to some extent, like, I think what people don't realize about apocalypticism is it's strangely hopeful in a naive way, but like you imagine this other world coming and you think that it's going to be better and that you just have to get rid of like the current, mess, and then it'll clear the way for something better.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And yeah, it's kind of like, now when I think back on that viewpoint, I think it's kind of horrifying, because any kind of societal, instability has so much potential for violence, and so often that is what happens. But there is kind of, I don't know, I think people, especially young people, honestly, do get kind of excited about that. There's like a utopian ideal associated with apocalypticism, and I felt like I kind of saw that in some of the people that I talked to, that they saw that the world was full of wickedness and sin, and the idea that a new heaven and a new earth was coming was more was appealing to them. But if you read the research on apocalypticism, like, you pretty quickly realize, at least from an ethnographic perspective, it's very hard to sustain that level of intense belief over long periods of time. And so most people end up falling into this camp that I call them cool millennialists in my book, but they end up being end-time believers in the sense that, they believe the Orthodox teaching that Jesus will return someday. But they're not living their lives like as if that could happen at any moment. They're putting money in their bank accounts. They're like planning for the future. They're not like, if you really truly believe that Jesus is coming back, like, that really changes your behavior.
Sure.
But
Right. Yeah.
the church, I'm sure like, and then pastors told me this too, like, live like he's coming today, plan like he's coming tomorrow. Like, you have to imagine at least that the world is continuing, otherwise it becomes a self-defeating prospect. So yeah, basically what I ended up finding was that most people in most of the churches I visited were these people, this group I call cool millennialists, millennialism being a term for belief in the end times, I guess, essentially. There's a lot of, as you and others may know, terminology associated with end time belief, like that.
We love our jargon. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Just try not having gone to seminary and trying to that stuff. It was a nightmare. I mean,
I can only imagine. It's hard. I mean, I've been in Christian circles my whole life, and as I started studying it academically, getting my head, I mean, even my first, this is somewhere a side note, but I've been at the university I'm at for 10 years, and students would throw around terms that were totally foreign to me. And it took me a lot of flipping through dictionaries to figure out what in the world they're talking about. So I can only imagine that if you weren't raised in Christian culture, it would have been 10 times worse. So kudos to you for wading through it.
It was confusing. And I think I focused, most of the, people like Bill Moyers and whatever had talked about premillennialism being the big, I don't know, boogeyman for environmental reasons, because I think that's such a predominant strain. But there's, that's not the only kind that's out there. And then trying to figure, it's not like people have like a card printed like, oh, I'm certified as like an amillennialist. So trying to, do I look at the individual or do I look at the church, and how do I, do I make my own judgment based on the church's statement if they don't directly say? That part gets really complicated. So yeah, so I basically found that most people were I made sort of an ethnographic characterization of it, which does not conform necessarily to how it looks in theology textbooks.
Sure.
But I said there's people who are super excited about the end times. And if you talk about climate change, are like, yes, that is another sign that the Lord is coming soon. And so they do.
Does that mean that they're, sorry to interrupt you, but does
Yeah.
that mean they're eager to bring about climate change? Like, are they trying to amplify it, or are they just not regretting that it's happening?
Yeah, I think it was more in a passive sense. I
Okay.
mean, nobody feels like they have power regarding climate change, whether they are
Mm,
accept it or not, you know?
yep.
So it's just like I'm living my life, and if you know, God wants that to happen, then it's gonna happen. But
Okay.
it wasn't, I mean, what could you do if you were trying to make climate change happen? Like me
Well,
as an
I think
average
you come across the cynics that say, drive your SUV, drive your truck, doesn't matter. Let's do the coal power plants and whatnot. And so I just, not that they could single-handedly drive it, but that it, and this is maybe me being a little bit cynical, and from years of wrestling with Christians who are skeptical, that it's really discouraging to me to hear language that is that flippantly
yeah.
dismissive. It almost seems like they are trying to make it worse, just to kind of put their thumb in the eye of environmentalists that they see as an antagonist. But
Yeah, actually do think that that is kind of where it comes from. I don't think there that it's the end time beliefs that are driving the environmental
no,
attitude.
yeah,
I think
no,
the environmental attitudes that are driving the end time beliefs, like, so, and I actually didn't run into anybody like that, but I know they exist. Like, you know, see people rolling coal and you're like, yeah, that that's out there.
yep.
But no, for me, it was the people that I ran into. I think, you know, when you're really in the sway of end time beliefs, you tend to be a little bit disconnected from the day to day because there's just not as much um, it's not as attractive to invest in like politics and, you
Yeah.
know, all the like the little things that people can do to try to like change society when if you think like it's all going to be swept away. So at least the people I met, I didn't feel like they were as engaged
Yeah.
politically. But then on the other side, most people I met who were what I called cool millennialists, they were, you know, they believed, you know, that Jesus was going to come back, but they, you know, said we know not the day or the hour, so we're just gonna, you know, live our lives and be as, you know, as faithful as possible and hope that, you know, and that's all we can do as Christians. And they, on the other hand, um, you know, while the hot millennialists were like, yeah, climate change is a sign that Jesus is coming back soon, the cool millennialists were like, yeah, I don't think so. No, like it's all just like scientists after grant money, and you know, they would bring
Hmm.
up Climate Gate, this controversy from around that time. My
Yep.
field research was in 2011 and 2012, so
Okay.
it was like at a particular moment, but so to me, I was like, okay, well, these are the people that everybody who is talking about end time beliefs being a driver of climate skepticism, this is who they're talking about. They're talking about premillennialists. And I went out and I talked to all these premillennialists, and like very few of them were giving end time beliefs as a reason to be, you know,
Mhm.
to believe that climate change, we shouldn't take it seriously.
Okay.
Um, and so I was like, I think something else is going on. And I couldn't figure out what it was for a while. I was just like, okay, I just had all these focus groups and like everybody's a skeptic pretty much. Like then percentages of skeptics in my focus groups was quite high. And ultimately, when I started in the field, I thought of the people that I was talking to as evangelicals, just like white evangelicals. But as I read more into the literature, like political science literature on the mobilization of evangelicals and just different ways that surveys have of dividing up evangelicals, I decided, I realized that the people I was talking to fit the profile of a subgroup of evangelicals called traditionalist evangelicals, who I
Mm.
think are basically the core of the Christian right, which is not all of evangelicalism. Like, obviously, a lot of times people get confused and think that, and I myself thought that these were equivalent, but no, there's a Christian right, which is like the politically, you know, mobilized on the Republican side arm of, you know, the broader evangelical tradition. Then there's like evangelicalism as a whole, which is not like, you know, fully committed to one, you know, particular
Yep.
political ideology. So the people I talked to were much more politicized, I guess I would say, or they, you know, they were highly devout. Um, uh, they were, I'm trying to like think back to the exact criteria of traditionalist evangelical. Oh, and they believe that critically to what I ended up finding, that sort of American culture is heading in a bad direction. It's being like led away from Christianity.
Yeah,
And so,
talk about that. Your discussion of the sort of the view of a culture war that was quite fascinating to read. It's something I had experienced, but I don't think I'd ever read it from an outsider's perspective, or from an academic perspective, I should say.
yeah.
Yeah, tell us about that, about what people shared with you on that subject.
Yeah. So, it's funny that it's interesting to hear that, hear you phrase it that way, because I've had a couple of Christians say the same thing to me, that, I've talked to, like, and to me it was a surprise because I didn't know that that worldview existed at all either. I was just like, "Yeah, we're all friends, right?" Like, um, so, so when I would talk about, when I would, in the focus groups bring up, well, first we started the focus groups, I would say, what does your church contribute to society? This is just a way of breaking the ice, kind of like getting to know each other. And then I would say, what challenges does the church face? And I started hearing about all these challenges that I had never even thought about, like, oh, the Bible's been taken out of public schools and we're not allowed to pray. And, all these things that just weren't on my radar. And so, but I didn't really think much of it at the time as it connected to environmental issues. Like, it just seemed like, okay, that was like the opening of the focus group. But then as I went back, I noticed that kind of similar sense that Christianity was under attack, and that it was, there are these elites or secularists, or, that people had different names for these groups, but, are trying to push Christianity out of the public sphere. I noticed that it was there, in pretty much all of the focus groups. And it was also, people would use that same language when they were talking about climate change. So I started to realize, okay, there's a sense of anger. There's an undertone of anger, I would say. And that carried over to when people were talking about climate change. And so then in reading, I went back and read this like classic study on evangelicalism, American evangelicalism, Embattled and Thriving. And it was like, oh, I recognize this portrait. This is exactly what I'm hearing people say, is they feel that they're embattled. And I learned that this was a broader narrative that's common in evangelicalism, or throughout evangelicalism, but particularly I think American evangelicalism. I don't think it's necessarily a global phenomenon. It is specific. It seems to be specific to American history and America, or evangelicals' sense of having a sort of special place in America. Not because they're the only ones that are special, but that Christianity has a special place in American culture. And so evangelicals, as practicing Christians carrying on the Orthodox tradition, have this special place. And so yeah, I mean, I think the classic connection of that embattled mentality, like a sense of being embattled with secular society, connecting that to climate change, was when people would just say, like, environmentalists are trying to deny my worldview. Like, I see that I'm trying to think of the exact quotes, but like, that's why I usually have like a PowerPoint slide up with me.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, like, they're trying to take, they're like, they already tried to take it away with evolution, and now they're trying to take away, like, evolution takes, undermines Christian teachings about the origins of humanity. Climate change undermines Christian teachings about the end times. And so instead of it being like, I don't care about climate change because I think the end is coming, people were actually like, I don't care about climate change because I see what you're doing, and it's just a ploy to try to replace Christian teachings about the end times.
Yep. Wow, that's really interesting. And it seemed like there's a willingness in certain Christian circles to see science. I mean, I think that we've got baggage around the evolution debate, that it's almost that same view. It's like, I see what you're doing, and you're trying to redefine my narrative about the beginning, and now you're trying to redefine my narrative about the end of time, I suppose. So this helps us see that it's really not necessarily about the science, right? I mean, we've talked very little about the science so far, and probably won't even get to it, because that seems to be minimally why people talk about their skepticism. Did you have people talk about the science, or whether they could trust the scientists, or was that an issue that came up very often?
Yeah, actually I did. And so I kind of divided in, I'm not sure if this is the best division, but like secular reasons for skepticism and religious reasons for skepticism. And I felt like they really dovetail together. They're almost inseparable.
Okay.
In the sense that the reason it was so easy to dismiss climate change as part of some secularist attempt to undermine Christian teachings was that they also felt they had all this evidence that the scientists were like cooking the books and just in it for the grant money, and Al Gore is a jerk and all these other things. Al Gore, it's funny, studies have found that Al Gore is like the #1 most mentioned figure when it comes to climate change, not within evangelical circles, but it totally held true in my focus groups as well. The finding was like, yes, his name was brought up more than anybody else's.
No, that's my experience as well. It's not true anymore because the students were too young to, or at least my current students were too young to remember it. But until 2015, I couldn't talk about climate change without Al Gore coming up. And it was just a sense that, I don't like that guy, and I can't conceive of a world in which he is right and I am wrong. He's wrong about everything, so he must be wrong on this as well. It was spiteful, hatred for Al Gore and Bill Clinton, and that it was like he just must be wrong on principle, which just was frustrating to hear students talk in those terms. It's like, oh, can we talk about the evidence as well, or just who's taking sides? But interesting to hear that you found that as well.
I sort of take that as evidence of some kind of a framing effect that, this is coming through the media and not through, and I notice this happens, like, I want to say, I know this happens certainly with liberal circles as well, that you start just looking at who somebody is and, can I trust this person? I'm not going to listen to anything they say if I don't trust them, if they're not one of my tribe. And I think people do that on both sides. And it's a real problem, because if you're just looking at who somebody is, you're never evaluating their argument. But at the same time, one of the tactics that people use to it's a primary tactic to undermine what people like Al Gore and others have said, is ad hominem attacks. So you're attacking their person and trying to make them seem untrustworthy. And so when you hear that somebody has such strong feelings about Al Gore, just like, why Al Gore? He's like a nerdy PhD.
Yeah.
Like, there's something to me, and I know people who feel that way. So and maybe they would deny that it's coming to them somehow through like the media, but I suspect that there's something going on there, something more going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some more moral psychology around, these people that I agree with on this moral topic, whether it's, whatever Christian social issue is hot that day, if I agree with them on this thing, they must be right about most of the other things they're covering as well. And I so disagree with Al Gore on, the political issues, that I must disagree with him on everything else as well. And so I have put too much time trying to figure this out without doing the research that you have, but there's a lot.
That's the thing, we take these cognitive shortcuts, because it is a lot of work to try to, I don't have time to go research every single issue myself, right? And so you just go for like, okay, I trust that person, or I trust that media source, or whatever. Like, that's the shortcut. It's inevitable to some extent. And I think it works pretty well if you have sources that are good. But right now we have a lot of misinformation. And so then it's very easy to sway people, because they've turned off their critical thinking and they're just like looking at whether a source is trustworthy.
Yeah. Which is where I'd like to go next, where you talk about sources that we trust and the media as an important avenue where we get our information from. You had some really interesting insights to talk about Christian media and their role and the how they talked about climate. What did you find in that arena?
So I, just to go back one step, I guess I eventually ended up deciding, so when I talk to people in the focus groups, they were like really kind of, I had that, there was that sense of frustration that was palpable and it was connected to climate change. And eventually I did a focus group with Seventh-day Adventists and like didn't feel that same sense of embattlement. And so that's what kind of made me realize there's something specific going on in evangelical subculture. And it was only later, kind of after I'd finished my field work, I thought I was pretty much done. And I was like, okay, I'm going to write out my concluding chapter to this and, turn it into a book and send it off. And I was like, well, I've made this claim that there's an embattled mentality. And why don't I look at what sort of evangelical leaders are saying and see if they're saying anything about climate change and see if it's connected to, does it reflect this same embattled mentality? Or at first, I didn't know what I was going to find, but I was like, well, we'll just see if this is reflected at the elite level as well, because in the mid 2000s, there had been this whole campaign to try to get evangelicals concerned about climate change, starting in 2005, 2006, there was the Evangelical Climate Initiative that took off. And so there had been a lot within evangelical circles. And so I was like, yeah, I'll just go see what the proponents and opponents of this idea is and like see if it kind of fits within my framework. And so the Cornwall Alliance, which I mentioned earlier, has a bunch of, it's the main evangelical climate skeptic organization, and they have created all these declarations and documents that people sign on to, if they agree that climate change is not a problem, or if, so addressing climate change will hurt the world's poor. That's their big argument. Even though in fact, addressing climate change is very beneficial to the poor, and that's the primary reason to do it. So I would take the names of the people who signed on, especially if they're well known, and just see what they had said about climate change. And I started realizing like, oh, and shows my naivete because I just didn't know the Christian world well, but I was like, oh yeah, these guys, they all have radio programs. Okay. And then I started looking at their radio programs, like in their archives, like, oh, they're talking about climate change a lot. Surprising. And they're saying just what I heard my informants say, the people that I talked to in the field, like that's oddly familiar. And
interesting.
So that, it just was like, I thought I was just wrapping up the book. And then I was like, okay, no, there's way a bigger piece of the story here. And that's how I kind of started looking at what people were saying in Christian media, particularly in print, or not print, radio and television. Yeah.
Okay, great. And that was a novel idea to me, but it makes sense. And it'd be interesting to look at rates of Christian media consumption.
Yeah, I have some stats on that actually.
Oh, do you? Yeah. Please share.
I'm not one of those people who can quote stats reliably from memory, so I decided to look them up. So I didn't write down the source here, but it's I think it's the National Association of Religious Broadcasters has done surveys, which is like for the affiliated with the NAE. 90% of evangelicals consume evangelical media each month, and 1 in 5 Americans consumes this kind of media on a daily basis. So like 20% of Americans, which is pretty significant. And then another study from the study that I mentioned earlier by Christian Smith, he did this national survey and then followed up with interviews, and the people that he interviewed, the average hours that evangelical respondents spent listening to Christian radio was 6.9 per week. So it was quite a bit. I don't know, like that seems like a lot. And
it have it on in the background or something, but yeah, it does.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. So, and even, I've had a couple of years to think about this now that like the material is out there, and realize that even if you are not listening to radio, like oftentimes you're influenced by the people around you who listen to it. Or, your pastor who listens to it. Pastors listen to radio even more so than do your average, like, churchgoer. So it's kind of, I started off thinking of it as almost like this propaganda effect that like, you're just hearing it on the climate change isn't real on the radio. And the people are like, okay, climate change isn't real. But I think it's almost like that's too simplistic. I think that media gets kind of embedded in your social world in a way that's very hard to extricate yourself from or even think critically about. So I think it's more complicated.
Yep. Well, it'd even be interesting to, as I think about Christian media today, is different from what it was 10 or 20 years ago, in that we have, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is a podcast like this for me as a Christian who, if I can out myself, I'm sort of politically independent and certainly environmental in my leanings on those issues. I always felt out of place listening to Christian media. But now we've got these independent sources popping up in podcasts that give voice to people that are more in line with my way of seeing things, and so I've got access to somebody that I can resonate with. Whereas 20 years ago, most Christian radio, I'd be like, I'm kind of on board with this topic, but not that one. And so that probably just further segregates us and puts us into our echo chambers, which might be more problematic. But at least from my perspective, the evolution of media has made Christian media more appealing to me, or at least my corner of it. So
I don't know if that's every issue, because one of the things that I've realized is the more you're around people who disagree with you, the more you have to think about your views.
Yep.
And I think part of the problem is the more siloed you get, the less you have to think critically, and the more vulnerable you are to being persuaded by bad information.
Yep.
So I think it's exciting to see what will happen. The ownership of media and Christian media is not representative of the views of evangelicals as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And so they actually kind of reinforce some of the dynamics that keep evangelicals apart, or basically if you do studies of what comes across in evangelical media, like on the news talk programs, for example, they're virtually all politically conservative, and that's not what all evangelicals are, but all the radio programs are, right? So there isn't a space, right? And I've talked to people who are familiar with that industry, and it's not like you can just go start a program, with your environmental show. No one's going to give you your time on America Family Radio, right? It's just not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it'll be interesting I think it's a really good thing. I think competition of ideas is important.
Yep. Well, I know this will be pure speculation to look into the crystal ball, but it seems like American evangelicalism is going through a lot of changes right now, at least in the outwash of the presidential election and the reconciliation around some of the history with race, and it just seems like we're at a big transition point right now. Is climate change and environmental issues playing a role in that? And are we seeing a genuine coming to grips with climate change in the near-term future, say the next 5 years, or do you feel like we're going to continue to get more? Or is the right going to continue to dig in their heels and insist that this is not a genuine concern?
Yeah, it's just so hard to say. I always try to be like, well, we don't know.
Well, yeah, which we don't, but I'll just say it. I have a lot of hope when I see the Black Christian church that is breaking the norms of what Christianity has to be. There's been an assumption for too long that Christians have to be politically right-wing. And I think we're starting to see that doesn't have to be the case. And so I'm hopeful that Christianity will become certainly not its own political party, but more apolitical. That seems like an unrealistic hope because it's so entrenched right now. But that we can learn to to take these issues topic by topic instead of segregating them into these false dichotomies that align with political parties. So that's what I would argue for, but I don't know if that's practically realistic or what would drive that pattern. So again, I know that you can't say with any certainty, but I'm just curious from someone who's studying it in greater detail than I am, if you see what way the tide is pushing things right now.
I think young people have a huge role to play. And I think that not only, of course, young people are the future, literally, but their participation in churches and their ability to, one of the broader patterns that's happening in America right now is secularization and the decline of churches. All across the spectrum, but it's hitting evangelicalism as well. And politicization is one of the major reasons, probably. Like, people are turned off by the way that politics and religion have become conflated, and they feel like it's not genuine anymore to their faith. And so I think leadership is going to need to recalibrate whether that bargain is worth it. I understand, even if I don't support I understand, that you might at some point be like, okay, we're going to make this political alliance because we're going to do good things through it. I'm sure that was the hope. But it is coming at such a cost even to the core mission at this point that you have to wonder if it's a self-defeating strategy. And I think younger people are growing up in a world, in a country that's way more multiracial. It's just a way, it's a much, much, much different country than it was in like 1950, even if you just look at demographic trends, and people are okay with that. It's not like the same world it was in 1950. And so nevertheless, of course, older generations tend to kind of have control over all social movements, right? Like, or at least the ones that have been around for as long. So yeah, we're at an inflection point, and the question is whether there's a graceful transition or kind of like a don't let the door hit you on the way out kind of transition. We'll see.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, this has been really great. Thanks so much for coming on. I, again, really appreciated your book. Anybody that really wants to understand, as I did, why Christians continue to be the predominant skeptics of climate change, the Gospel of Climate Skepticism is a great place to start. Robin, can you tell us a little bit more about what you're working on now, and or where our audience can find you if they're interested in reaching out or seeing what you're working on next?
Yeah, I mean, I am on Twitter. I actually had to write down my Twitter handle because I don't ever use it as an address. It's at Robin G. Veldman. So yeah, I'm on Twitter. I'm not super active, as you can tell. It's not like, I don't know. I'm one of those people who believes that you need to be able to moderate your conversation for who you're talking to, and Twitter doesn't allow you to do that, and I don't like it. So
yeah.
because I think it's very important for the social world that you don't say everything to everybody, and whatever. Anyway, so yeah, I am on Twitter. I am looking at. I'm actually trying to understand how. I'm looking at the intersection of Christian nationalism and anti-environmentalism. So even broader than the evangelical sphere, there's so much of what I saw in the evangelical world, I think, is actually not coming necessarily from pastors or, people like Chuck Colson and Pat Robertson, but coming from talk radio that is kind of Christian inflected, so, and I think Rush Limbaugh is one of those folks, and so is Glenn Beck. So I've been looking, in particular, I've been focusing on Glenn Beck and trying to understand what he says about climate change and what he says about religion and how that has shaped the American public's understanding of themselves. And also, of course, climate change is kind of my focus.
Yeah, that sounds like an important topic. I'll be interested to see what you find. So, well, thanks again for coming on. It was a pleasure to talk to you. And thanks again for sharing your research with us. It's a great insight, and hopefully we can use it to hopefully deal with some of these tensions and get to a point where Christians can take the call to stewardship, as we say, a little bit more to heart. So,
yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was anybody who writes a book knows it is so, we appreciate so much anybody who actually reads it. It's just such a pleasure to talk to somebody about it, and yeah, it's been fun.
Thanks again.